estou aqui para fazer a apresentação rápida, uma dispensa de apresentações do nosso convidado. É uma honra para nós, para a SBGames, trazer a Kellee Santiago para cá para conversar com vocês. Ela ficou aqui durante todo o evento, conversando com as pessoas e tal. A Kellee Santiago, quem não sabe, é a produtora do Journey, do Flower e do Flow, são jogos, são sucessos da PlayStation 3. Ela é uma das sócias fundadoras da ThatGameCompany e agora ela está no UIA, ela está falando com os desenvolvedores para levar os seus jogos para lá também. Ela também é uma dos membros do IndieFund. Então é isso, é uma honra para nós e eu peço para vocês uma salva de palmas para a Kellee Santiago.
I think I'm the last or one of the last talks of the day, so I just wanted to give another round of applause to the organizers of this festival. I've had so much fun. It's been so awesome. Yeah! It's been so awesome to be able to connect and meet with you all and talk about games. And are any of the participants of the Game Jam here by any chance? Awesome, guys. Well, we've all been talking the talk. You've been walking the walk and actually made stuff. That's so cool. So, congrats. So, yes, hello. I'm Kellee Santiago. I'm a game developer, producer, and advocate. This is the best way I've found to describe my work. I believe that games can be both deeply meaningful and wildly entertaining, and I create, work, and talk to try and demonstrate that and promote that. In 2006, I co-founded a development studio called ThatGameCompany, which started with 4 people and ended with 13 people before I left, so pretty small. And it was with the goal to create video games that explored different emotions than the video game marketplace offered at the time, with the idea that by doing this, we could attract new types of gamers and make video games more relevant as an artistic medium. And we developed 3 games for PlayStation Network, which are showing up in a random order, Flow, Flower, and Journey. Thank you. I'll be talking about all this a lot more. In 2010, I co-founded an angel investment fund called IndieFund with 6 other super awesome independent game developers. So the mission of IndieFund is to help independent developers get and stay financially independent. I also became kind of a noted advocate for video games as an artistic medium, in large part due to my 2009 TEDx talk called Video Games Are Art, What's Next, which you can find on the TED website, followed by a fellowship in the TED Fellows program, which I highly recommend applying to if you have any interest in the TED community. It's a really awesome program for innovators and entrepreneurs. I also participate as an advisor on a number of independent game conferences and programs to promote games as an artistic craft, including the Indiecade Festival of Games in Los Angeles, the Independent Games Summit at the Game Developers Conference San Francisco, and also pretty recently the Art of Video Games exhibit, which opened a couple years ago at the Smithsonian Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and did a tour throughout the United States, part of which Flower was one of the games selected and is now a permanent installation at the Smithsonian Art Museum. I currently work as head of developer relations for a console called Ouya. One of the games coming out next year is Thralled, which was a finalist at the festival here, so I hope you got a chance to check it out. Despite popular opinion, I'm actually not all that interested in whether games are art or not. I think it's important to accept them as art because then we get to what I think of as more interesting conversations about our artistic responsibility as creators, our place in culture, and the vocabulary with which we use to describe our feelings about games and how they impact us. I I come from a background in music and theater, and some people might see my path into games as a regression, but I think you guys see it the opposite like I do, which is a very natural evolution of my interests in expression and technology and my fascination with its ever-changing and growing place in our society. I love being in flow, which is a concept I'll talk more about, and creating a sense of flow for those around me, especially in unexpected scenarios. I'm the kind of person who's really sensitive to the mood of those around me because I want everyone to be engaged in a situation in their own way, whatever that might be. And I also really love subcultures. I love hearing about or reading or watching or finding people who are so completely wrapped up in an activity that they're just happy engaging with it. Both, I think, of these passions, subcultures and flow, led me into being a game maker. I grew up in a small suburb of Midlothian, Virginia, and my parents instilled in me from early on an appreciation for the arts and for reading and culture. My father had an extensive classical music record collection, and this might be what set me apart a little bit from other kids early on, therefore driving me further into the arts, which is a place I think people go to in order to find their own tribe. Another passion in my life that I had for so long that I couldn't remember when it started was to move to New York City. So between my interest in performance and my single-mindedness about where I was going to go once I left that small suburb in Virginia, I went to the New York University Tisch School of the Arts theater program. After college, I stayed in New York for a few years. I produced and managed some shows. I performed in an improv group, and I taught arts or arts-related courses at various schools around New York. I really loved working on original shows as opposed to the remounting of old classic plays, and more of these shows were incorporating digital and interactive media elements. And I, being the general tinkerer person that I am, kind of picked up the tasks around managing and developing these digital elements of performances. So I decided to pursue a master's degree that would let me build up this skill set faster than I was on my own. And that's what brought me to the Los Angeles University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts Interactive Media Division, which was a Master of Fine Arts program. Brand new at the time. I was in the second incoming class. And I took a class, wait, let me go back a second. So it was at USC that the thought of game maker clicked in for me, and it clicked in two ways. So one was that I took a class taught by this woman, Tracy Fullerton, who's now the chair of the interactive media department. But when I was there, she was just teaching a couple of game design courses, and she had just written this book, Game Design Workshop. The first class I had taught by her was a critical studies course on game design and the history of game design, but throughout human history. And that's where I became aware that play went beyond just the specific games that I was aware of, whether they were digital or even the analog games that I played. It's where I grew to understand that play has a place in our culture as beings, as mammals. We can see this in other animals, in fact. Play is a vital part of growth as it gives dogs, humans, and really most species the ability to learn and develop skills that we'll need as we grow up. This newfound knowledge validated for me something that I kind of had felt for a long time, which is that games were a medium. And if games are a medium, that meant we could communicate a variety of ideas and stories through them, just like every other medium. It meant that video games didn't have to be what they were. And in fact, that video games had only covered a tiny sliver of possible experiences. When we look at video games as a form of entertainment, well, entertainment is a really broad field. It's not just video games, but it's movies and TV and literature and newspaper and all kinds of activities people do to entertain themselves. But with such a wide definition, what does entertainment really mean in its soul? What's the purpose of entertainment? Well, just as humans have the desire to eat and drink, we also have desires to have feelings, to have certain feelings. And these feelings are not just simple one-off emotions, but they're more like vitamins. There's a whole range of emotions, and we start to feel a little off if we're lacking any one of them. From ancient tribes to modern society, our environment has always been highly competitive and emotionally stressful. And many of us have problems feeling accomplished or satisfied. And this desire for feelings have been with us since the very beginning of our civilization. As civilization evolves, we've invented various means and ways to satisfy our emotional needs. And today it continues. Novels, TVs, and video games are quite effective right off the couch. As long as these methods and ways make us fulfill our desire to feel better or more satisfied, that's entertainment. Whether it's real or virtual, entertainment is a way to make us feel certain emotions without embarrassing ourselves in modern society. It sort of lets us get it out. So that's why when we look at video games as an entertainment, the feeling video games evokes are very important things to think about. So the second thing that happened to me at USC that really inspired me to go into making games was that I got to attend the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. It's a conference that happens once a year, and it started with a few people gathering in someone's backyards, and now it's over 15,000 people that attend. But it still has the same spirit, which is people coming together to discuss the lessons they've learned over the last year and share in not just their successes, but also their failures, which is, I think, pretty unique in any industry to do that. And I got to meet all these incredible people who made and make games that I love and people I've never met before. I found a lot of people who, like me, were multidisciplinarians, and they're interested in science and math, the arts, and psychology and anthropology. And I found like I'd finally really found my tribe. But where do I go from here? Well, I tried to start working on as many game projects as I could. And in my second year at USC, the newly formed Game Innovation Lab offered a small grant to a student project to create an innovative game. That was the goal, create an innovative game. And Genova Chen, who would later co-found that game company with me, asked me to help out as a producer, so I hopped on board. So this was at the beginning of 2005, and a Grand Theft Auto game had recently been released. I think it was San Andreas had been released. Which meant that then, much like what happens now when a Grand Theft Auto game comes out, there's a huge surge in the media of games being too violent and being bad for children. So in thinking about how to make an innovative game, we wondered if we could make a game that didn't express any of the emotions that were typically associated with games. Violence, addiction, stress, and a lot of times if it's not one of those three, it's silly, humorous comedy games. Could we push the communicative possibilities of games as a medium? Could games really be about something else? We kind of felt like most games either fell into a commercial category or artsy, academic, niche games that only a few people would play and find really interesting. Could we make something that expressed a unique emotion but also had a mass appeal? So Genova thought to make a game that made you feel as though you were a child daydreaming and looking up at the clouds. That this kind of childlike imagination and peacefulness was not something that you usually got out of a video game, but was something that anyone could relate to, regardless of their gender or where they came from, and very importantly, whether or not they were a gamer. And this is what led to cloud. So in Cloud, you play as a boy who's trapped in a hospital and daydreams he can fly through the clouds. It's a pretty simplistic game. Honestly, when it came time to finishing the project, we didn't quite know what this boy should be doing, and so there are 4 levels that demonstrate different possible mechanics. You have this Katamari Damacy-like mechanic of gathering up lots of clouds. In another level, you learn that you can suck up clouds and then blow them out again to draw figures in the sky. And then you have another level where you encounter these dark pollution clouds and you have to use the white clouds to turn them into rain and clear off this city. There are no enemies, no time limits. Again, it was meant to be a very peaceful experience, and we certainly had a lot of arguments with our advisors to put in some kind of antagonist, some kind of enemy, that you couldn't really have a game without conflict. But we didn't feel like that was true to the experience, and we made it available for people to download at festivals. At the time, indie games and student game projects were very small, and so we figured a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people would download it. Within a few months, we had over 400,000 downloads, and we had crashed our school servers twice. It had to be moved over to Electronic Arts servers, who they volunteered to host it. And so it was really validating that people were interested in games that offered these unique kinds of emotions. But where do we go from here? What kind of feelings do we want to innovate upon when we think about building a company around this? Well, when we look at the established entertainment media, people talk, and when they talk and critique them, they use words to describe their feelings, the things that they feel when they experience the work. You know, you look at films and television, people even divide them based on the feelings that they evoke, from maybe positive emotions to negative emotions. However, when you look at video games, people are still really mainly talking about features as if it's purely a software product, although it's slowly changing now. As various video game genres emerge over time, they still really concentrate, when you look at them through the lens of emotions, they concentrate around kind of 4 primary emotions: stimulation, empowerment, addiction or zoning out, or immersion, or some combination of these, right? The emotional spectrum of video games are still heavily biased towards young people because they are these very easy to understand emotions. They're not very nuanced. And in fact, this is a phenomenon that's really natural to any new medium. When you look at early cinema, you can see similar trends found in the movies that were being made. But as film and its audiences grew and grew up, their desires for feelings grew as well. And slowly the spectrum got more complete and more even distribution. And when it comes to video games, we think the desire for feelings doesn't change. As gamers grow up, while the same fun feeling still works, it's still nice to play fun video games, we start to ask for something more. You know, what else could we get from a video game? Could our games be more serious? Could we reach higher levels of joy, to ecstasy? Could we reach a higher level or deeper level of sadness? Could we reach catharsis? And there's just so many spaces in the video game spectrum for us to saturate and think about. And all of these feelings would be quite unique and unknown to the game design world, which is a great position to have as a new independent game studio. But how do you go about evoking unique emotions? Well, a lot of people talk about looking at other media and how they do it. You know, in film, for example, which has that wider and more saturated spectrum, it's true, a lot of people in games have borrowed a lot of the methodologies from film. Film as a multimedia is made of moving images and sound, but pure, good high graphic images and sound don't guarantee that it's a good movie. There are various underlying techniques in art, such as cinematography and story and acting and directing. And they're all about how to put visual and sound together to create certain emotional impact on the audience. However, when it comes to video games, there's one more major element, which is interaction. Unfortunately, our understanding of how video games communicate through interaction is really still just making its first baby steps. And the vocabulary of video game emotions is quite limited. You know, it's mainly, is something fun or not? That's often how people talk about it. The craft and techniques of creating emotional impact with visual, audio, and interaction, it's not really formalized. So let's keep looking at other mediums for inspiration in this subject. How can we evoke unique emotions in games? How can we bring more people into experiences that they're not used to when it comes to video games? And this line of thinking is what led Genova to really pursue flow theory for his master's thesis project, and really laid a foundation for that game company as a studio. So flow is the theory of how we as humans become completely engaged in an activity, which is also a kind of happiness. So this guy, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, found in the early 70s that little research had really been done on happiness, even though lots of research had been done on the emotions opposite of happiness. So there's been a lot of psychological research done on loneliness and depression and anxiety and fears. Not a lot of people will really know, even today, it's still a growing field of like why we get happy or what makes us happy. So he spent the following 20 years interviewing surgeons, surfers, athletes, and all kinds of people with different backgrounds and professions to understand this level of engagement, like how you lose yourself in something in pure joy. And many people described it as the feeling of like flowing through water, independent of one another. So that's how he got the name flow theory for this psychological state. So flow is the mental state of operation in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement, and enjoyment of the process of the activity. In essence, flow is characterized by complete absorption in what one does, which I think we can all relate to when it comes to thinking about some of our favorite video games. We also were taking inspiration. I was doing work at USC in looking at the new games movement, which also coincidentally started in the early 70s, but dealt with analog games. So Stuart Brand, who's a futurist, was coming back from the Vietnam War and saw a correlation between our culture of competitive sports games in the United States and a culture of war. And so he wanted to attempt to subvert this by creating a new definition of games and encouraging people to play games together in different ways. And so they would have these huge events where people would gather, and a lot of the games were very cooperative, non-competitive, or dealt with kind of some silliness and embarrassment factor. But one of the fundamental principles was that you as a player had the right at any moment, if you weren't having fun, you could leave and join another game that was in progress. Or you could change the rules of the game to be an activity that you really loved. So owning something, actually, I don't know if you have it here, but have any of you, maybe when you were young in school, played a game where you have a giant rainbow parachute and you like throw it up in the air and run underneath it? Maybe that's a new games game anyways. And one of the co-founders or leaders of the movement was this guy, Bernie DeKoven, who wrote this awesome book, The Well-Played Game, and really kind of looked at those philosophies and how they can shape culture and how they continue to shape culture today. He has this great blog, you should check it out, where he's constantly looking at new games and ways of playing with each other. So understanding that games are also kind of political, that they can be a way of shaping culture. And Bernie DeKoven talks about how great games are a balance between challenge and ability. And that's something I'll talk about more, which is a state of flow. So it's a challenging activity that requires skill. It's the merging of action and awareness, has clear goals for the player, direct feedback, concentration on the task at hand, sense of control, the loss of self-consciousness, so not kind of caring about what you look like. And the transformation of time is really important, losing yourself in it. So flow theory postulates 3 conditions that have to be met to achieve flow. One must be involved in an activity with a clear set of goals and progress. The task at hand must have clear and immediate feedback. And one must have a good balance between perceived challenges of the task at hand and the perceived skill set, right? It can't be too challenging or you get frustrated, and it can't be too boring or you quit. So in applying this to video games, Genova found that the ideal state was, instead of giving people easy, medium, difficult to choose from, if you could find a core activity that allowed the player to determine the kind of experience they were going to have, then they could find their own flow state. Interesting enough, there's a really great example of this, which is Grand Theft Auto. In Grand Theft Auto, you drive, and by driving, you can determine the kind of game experience you want to have. Do you want to have mission-driven, story-based experience? Do you want to just go around and check out the city? Or do you want to have a really hardcore, challenging experience of racking up your wanted score and having the, army come after you? And not only can you choose that based on how good you are at the game, but it can change from day to day, depending on what your mood is. And so if you can achieve that within your game, you can have a game that attracts more people and is one that they're going to play more over time. So this led to the Flash game Flow, which then became our first title with Sony for PlayStation 3. And I'll show you some video footage of that. Let's see if it plays. So Flow is a very simplistic application compared to Grand Theft Auto of this idea. And by playing as this abstract aquatic organism, you have the act of eating, and eating is what determines your experience. So you eat foods to go down and dive further into the world, and you can continue to do that if you just kind of want to be a tourist. Or you can engage in combat with other organisms, and as you eat, you grow your body. So there's kind of a creative element to it as well. So I spent a bit of time talking about this, but it's because it became the backbone for all our work going forward. The combination of trying to communicate unique emotions in video games while applying these fundamental principles of how you go about creating a fun or engaging experience in order to create games that were new and different, but also would have mass appeal, because as many people as possible would be interested in engaging with these fundamentally fun experiences. And maybe even tricking some people into having fun with them that wouldn't have otherwise. So Flower for PlayStation 3 was the first game really we got to do from beginning to end with this mindset, with everything we had learned from Cloud about creating a new type of emotion games, and everything we learned from Flow in how you could go about creating valuable, engaging experiences. So in the beginning, our goals for Flower, because we started every project with an emotional goal, so what we wanted to communicate was that we wanted to create this game that felt genuine, that would be able to relate to people across gender and age and culture, and would leave you with a positive emotional response. We wanted to create an emotional shelter, made you feel safe and peaceful, and really a feel-good game. We kind of compared it initially a lot to the film Amelie, that sort of light, positive feeling you might leave with after playing Flower. So the very first prototype with Flower was in processing, and it was about blowing petals around. You just moved these little circles and let them float through the air. And that was pretty neat, but there wasn't really a game there. So we did some more prototyping. The second was a Flash prototype where you used this little sun to impact the way a plant grew. And it was part procedural content, which was really hot at the time. This was like right after Spore, right as Spore was coming out. But it wasn't really engaging and wasn't making this feeling of a safe emotional shelter that we were going for. At the same time, we were prototyping on the PlayStation 3 our ability to just create a field of as many flowers as we possibly could. And so this was a great opportunity to sort of figure out a major technical unknown, which is what could we possibly do? So we ended up with like a pretty cool looking field of flowers, but now what? Like who were you playing in this field of flowers? What would you be doing? One of the first concepts was to what we nicknamed a first-person thinker. So we thought it was cool, this way that when you look at something, you know, your consciousness really goes to that place. It's as if you're there and you sort of focus in and everything else goes away. And so we had this environment, we were prototyping in XNA, where you moved around in that way. You would focus in on something and then you would whoosh. Literally, that was the sound effect. Whoosh, you go there. And it was really cool, and I still think it's really cool, but we couldn't figure out what a cool game would be with that. So we had to abandon it because we were on a time crunch. So maybe you were this traveling seed. That was an idea that seemed pretty natural. A lot of people were thinking about it at the time and mentioning it. You could then like gather up this sort of swarm of petals which is what that was one of the ideas that got into the final game. And because you had this seed, but it was sort of boring to watch just this like ball fly across. So it's like, okay, let's do a bunch of petals. That's nice and pretty and a little bit more dynamic, and you fly around. But again, we were getting pressure to think about challenge and skill and these traditional ways that games pull us in. Those are the ways that games engage us. And we weren't pretending to know everything about game development, so we wanted to understand what aspects, again, of traditional games, what are the things that people gravitate to in traditional games that we could apply in our games to get people to play these weird, new, unique, different games that they might think or dismiss offhand. So maybe you had to survive as a petal in this weird environment, and there would be a timer on how long you survived. And when you ran into different types of flowers, you would gather up abilities and then be able to use them. But all along the way, we're play testing. We usually tried to play test every 2 weeks or so, regardless of what we had, just to get people to come in and give us feedback. And the feedback was that it did not really make you feel like you were in a field of flowers. So we dialed it back. We dialed back the challenge, and we ended up with the mechanics really that you see in the game today, which is somewhere in the middle, but more towards an ambient, relax in a field of flowers sort of emotion. So in Flower, you start in this really dingy urban apartment, and you have a flower on your windowsill, and you focus in on it, and you're taken into what we kind of thought of as a daydream of a flower in these open, wide fields. And the game progresses, and you see more urban elements as you go through, more urban architecture. The windmills is the first sign of it that you see. And then you go into a city, and you kind of bring nature into the city to revive it, and combining these two elements. So we ended up with this mission of making a game that made you feel in balance, that it was about balance and harmony. So when we started on our third project journey, we wanted to create an experience that gave you a genuine connection between strangers. There was an idea of using the monomyth, Joseph Campbell's Hero of 1,000 Faces, which is this structure of a story that he has identified as being prevalent in stories for thousands of years, that there's these common themes and structure of a story that we love to hear. And again, in thinking about creating experiences that a lot of people would relate to, no matter where they came from, the hero's journey was a natural fit for us to explore. And a feeling of transcendence, which I'll talk a little bit more about. we wanted to reimagine multiplayer experiences from a technical standpoint. So we had a 3-game deal with Sony. We were about to start our 3rd game, and we had never made an online game. Flow and Flower were both local single-player experiences only. And so we wanted to, before we ended this possible tenure with Sony, to try it out and see what did it mean to make a ThatGameCompany game online. Certainly online console games traditionally take the place on some form of battleground, are filled with emotions of empowerment and aggression. And so players aren't really motivated to connect with one another. But when you take all of these things away, all of the elements of the battleground, you leave it open to possibly having more connection. But what we were seeing, this was kind of happening on PlayStation Home at the time, but certainly Second Life or Chat Roulette, the less savory characters start to dominate the space. We wanted to create an experience in which you really connected with one another as human beings, and not just as this object that you use to progress through the game. Well, these people are trying to share their emotions, but really online games, it's like, oh, please. No. Can't help. We wanted to use gameplay to increase the awareness of other players. Animation's broken on this one, but of that other player as opposed to objects and AI. And de-emphasize their own power in relationship to the world around them. To really focus, really so the player couldn't focus on anything except that human-to-human connection. When I talked about transcendence, we were thinking about, when you think about the moments in which you feel helpless or humbled to the world around you, they're few and far between these days. I think we're really powerful as people with technology. We can drive really fast. We can work in offices that are on top of clouds. We can connect to anyone, anywhere, at any time, and access information beyond our capacity to understand it. But this power is pretty commonplace, maybe a bit too commonplace. And in our video game lives, it's the same. We often are wielding extremely powerful tools, and our game lives become expressions of our ability to be powerful over the environment. Genova and I got to meet this man, Charles Broden Jr., who was a space shuttle pilot. So he got to fly people that would then walk on the moon. And he was telling us, it was so great, because I'm sure he's asked all the time about what it's like, and Genova and I had to ask him what it was like. And he talked about how every single person that he had gotten to take to walk on the moon, they started off, when they went there, as an atheist or agnostic. When they returned, they became religious at some point, very religious or spiritual. And he wondered why that might be. And we thought, well, when you're on the moon and you get to look at the Earth and everything you know so far away, right, that you can't help but be in awe of that. And wouldn't it be great if we could bring that to people in the form of a video game? That maybe awe and wonder are sort of fundamental emotions that are important, and we shouldn't be lacking of them. So that's all well and good, but we were dealing with reality. We knew we had to make a PlayStation 3 game specifically. So immediately we knew that we wouldn't be dealing with keyboards and headphones because not a lot of people with PlayStation 3s were using them to play games, which might have been things that we would have done if we had been building a PC game. And sometimes on console, you don't really want to know who's on the other side. So, I mean, you can just look at the roster of gamer tags and you can see, right? So we decided to really challenge ourselves to make an online game that was about connecting with other people, but you wouldn't be able to talk or chat with each other. Because why not make it harder on ourselves? So the concepts in our games, they really come from every direction. A lot of people ask, where did you get the inspiration from? Where do you get the ideas from? But I think they kind of accumulate from many different places. And one of the ways we generate ideas around the game is to start generating concept art around what it might feel like and look like to be in this game. And some of the early art concepts from both Genova and Matt reflect this sense of smallness and wonder and began kind of contextualizing the environment that we would later build. This kind of looks like a part that might be in the game. This doesn't. We weren't able to create waterfalls. We created sandfalls. And after a few months, we kind of began to think about this experience as akin to hiking, that was a good metaphor for what we were going for. That the way you, when you're hiking, you can meet up with someone and maybe walk together for a while, or you just say hi and you walk away. So even though we're just looking at paintings right now in the process, we're already starting to get a sense of gameplay as well as the technology that we're going to have to build, because now we're talking about what would eventually become our seamless lobby system. And in this image too is this sense of that element of co-op play that we didn't want. Again, we didn't want a game where you felt co-op was using someone. Oh, I need you to stand on this and pull this lever, and I'm going to pull this lever over here, because that really makes the other person feel like a tool. Like they are a tool in that respect. This is more about we're cooperating and sharing a moment together. Oh wow, look at this. Look at this place in this game. And maybe you would lose one another, encounter different environments and possibly weird creatures. So some of the ideas for early gameplay involved bracing against the wind, helping each other overcome obstacles, maybe avoiding dangerous creatures. We had this idea of collaborative climbing. You know, you could, maybe there was a boulder in your way and you needed that other person to like help you up. This is more on the concept of helping avoid enemies by like distracting them. One person distracts them from the other person as they can cross. Having big weather events like a sandstorm and you just have to shelter in together, so forcing the players to be very close to one another. And we also didn't know at this time how many people would be meaningful to connect at one time. And this was a really important piece of information we needed to assess the technical feasibility, because connecting 2 people is different than connecting 4 people together. And we really started working on this prototype of a Flash game called Dragon. So in Dragon, there's these cloth pieces that are the other circles available for harvesting. But there are different sizes that require 2 or more players in order to get, and they affect your size and your speed. You have a shout radius, so shouting was something that was in the game from the very beginning and stayed through the end. Here you have players helping each other over walls and obstacles. Your view radius would change when you were playing with someone else to make you feel more powerful, so that might be a subtle way of encouraging people to play with one another. And And the co-op mechanics included 4-player slipstreaming, so moving through quickly when someone was in the lead, you'd be able to catch up to them by walking over their path. Pushing rocks around together and hiding from the sandstorms. And there were monsters. They kind of stayed in through the game. But we found that with 4 players, there was just often these dynamics of 2 players versus 2 players, or one, or like me versus them. And we weren't getting to that place of feeling like you had this faith in humanity that we were going for. So in addition to flow, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi also have these concepts of co-liberation, which is what happens when we work extraordinarily well with one another. So we were kind of going back to our roots when it came to Journey. Like in a basketball team or an orchestra, when we actually experience ourselves sharing in something bigger, then we have a sense of joy. And that's the experience of the big we. It's corollary to the experience of the big me, which is of individuality. And if, similar to challenge and skill, if you find yourself in 2 on your own, you have feelings of isolation. But if you're lost in the crowd, you have feelings of conformity. And so in sort of thinking about creating that ideal 2-player co-op experience, we wanted to see how we could hit this sweet middle spot of collaboration. So in Journey, what we initially prototyped and went into the game was that there's this idea of just the right way of discovering a person, that there'd be sort of this space. You didn't want someone too close to you, or else they just pop and appear into your game. And you didn't want someone so far away that you would never find them. But instead, there's sort of this area of interest that people lie in that makes it feel very natural when you happen upon them. You're still free to choose which way you go. And if it turns out you don't really like journeying with each other, you can simply move away and you'll be disconnected from that person and left open to connecting to someone else. And we thought this would also help to allow players, similarly to allowing players through the core mechanic to determine their own experience. Through the core mechanics, we could also let people find those players that they really enjoyed playing with. Players that liked checking out all the sites and seeing every little thing, well, they would naturally sort of be in the same area of interest with one another. And ones that wanted to charge forward and just get everything done, they would naturally be in the same space together. This was an early 3D prototype on the PlayStation 3 of Journey. You can see a very different person. This was another. So very different art styles we were kind of taking a look at. Effects on the environment. And this person, what would this person look like? We wanted a gender-neutral character. And actually one of the things that was a big motivator for our decisions around character design was also our technical abilities, or more so limitations as a team. So the final Journey character has no arms, because when you have arms, people expect you to be able to climb and touch one another and push each other, and we just weren't going to be able to do that. So we cut off the arms. Make it easy. And we also went to this place a few hours north of Los Angeles called Bismo Beach. Has these awesome dunes. And that's where we really found that one of the great tools we could use for feedback, because we were really struggling with these ideas, like how do you make it interesting to walk to a mountain in the desert? That's got to be one of the most boring things. Well, it turns out the act of walking through sand is a pretty incredible feedback. The way it moves, the way the wind blows, And these are the things that would really feed into the core mechanics and the experience of the game. We started with this idea of creating a game that lets you feel like together we can move the mountain, but that turned out to feel too much like you were using that other person to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. And what we ended up with was we all walk the path, each journey is different. So that you would have this feeling that you empathize with that other player that you saw because you understood the journey that they were on, but you were going to experience it differently because you're different people. And every time you play it, you might experience it a little differently as well. I think some people mistakenly feel like our games don't have traditional feedback systems in them of other games, when they really do, because they're important to engaging people in these interactive experiences. Is just that we try to embed them in the environment and the world of the game as much as possible. I remember a conversation I had with one of our producers at Sony, and he asked me about replayability and why were people going to come back and play this game, and wouldn't it be better if you added some things that you could only collect if you went through multiple times? Why were people going to play again? And I said, well, they'll play again because it's going to be so awesome to be there. And that's a feedback. So, the future, and what does this mean for you? Well, having fun is just the surface of understanding flow, and just like understanding games is fun or addictive is just barely scratching the surface. Csikszentmihalyi describes his life's work as the effort to study what makes people truly happy, and the emphasis here is on the word truly because to him, happiness is not simply flow, nor an emotional state, nor even the experience of pleasure. The happiness he points to involves the continual challenge to go beyond oneself as part of something greater than one's own self-interest. And when I think about that, I think about how today we're so connected to one another in ways no one in the course of human history has been before. And we're more connected to the world and to information than we have been ever before. But what do we do with it? We share pictures of what we've eaten and things we've bought, and cats, but that's okay. Okay, I'm going to quote Mihai Csikszentmihalyi one more time, and it's a little long, so bear with me. He says, "But I don't think the direction of evolution is laid down in any sense. We, having become aware of what is going on, have to decide for ourselves to what end this information should be directed and where it should be going. And I think that from an abstract level, the signposts for those decisions are again differentiation, me, and integration, we. You want a future where people are free to develop whatever unique blueprints they carry in their genes, and you want that freedom to blossom as much as possible, but at the same time, you want each person to see that they are a part of something much greater. That's where integration comes in. It starts with feeling that you belong to a family, to an ethnic group, to a church, and to a nation. But unless you realize that you're also a part of all living systems on the planet, there's something beyond all of this that we can sense. Unless you're part of that, then evolution would not be very successful as far as I can tell. End quote. Games are great at engaging us in activities. Game design can connect us to one another and to the world around us in deeper and more meaningful ways. As game makers, you all have this ability to lay the foundations, the next steps of our culture, of what you think it's important for people to learn and understand through play. So what will you do with your skills and your craft? What are the things you think people should feel, should understand, and how do you think we can grow as people? These are the things I urge you to think about, because unless you're a part of this, then the evolution of games will not be very successful as far as I can tell. Thank you, and I look forward to playing all of your games.